This is hell.
We're all apparently freaking out about inflation. Not that we need to. In fact, there can actually be good inflation. Who knew? For instance, did you know that keeping inflation low contributes to the wage productivity gap we've been experiencing over the past 40 years that have seen our earnings stagnate as the wealth of the richest people has skyrocketed? So how worried should we be about reports that Thanksgiving will be much more expensive this year, as was reported on the front page of the New York Times, especially when retail sales somehow continue to rise? Here to help us understand inflation better, Rob Larson is the current affairs economist in residence, and he wrote the article, How Serious is the Inflation Situation? Welcome back to This Is Hell, Rob.
Thanks, Chuck. It's my pleasure to be back.
It's always great having you on the show. Now, the last time we had you on the show, a few days later, we had to shut down most of our operations here because of the pandemic finally coming here to Chicago. What is this interview going to cause us, Rob?
Hopefully a smaller wave of disease than the last one. Just trying to keep it down to like a smaller disease.
I really appreciate that. I think that's very thoughtful of you. So you write that lately the right wing has returned to a classic bête noire of theirs, inflation. Breitbart writes that Bidenflation is burning white hot, while the Wall Street Journal complains that Mr. Biden ought to be enjoying an economic boom from the ebbing pandemic as the government lockdowns end. Instead, his policies have abetted a spike in inflation that is outstripping gains in wages. Telling people not to believe what they see with their own eyes is rarely a good political strategy. The idea, Rob, is that government spending leads to inflation, and therefore, if you do not want prices to go up, you cut government spending. So to what extent is that true? Does government spending, especially massive government spending like we saw with the pandemic, always lead to inflation? Because if that's the case, it's only going to get worse when we have massive infrastructure spending or when we have to spend due to climate change. So is it the case that government spending always leads to inflation?
No. The fact is, government spending can contribute to an inflationary situation. But of course, like anything else, it depends on what's going on in the economy. And as you were sort of referring to a moment ago, there are a couple of sort of related dynamics that can cause inflation in the economy. And exactly how much inflation we're going to get is always sort of unclear. But laying it at the feet of government spending is kind of a goofy thing. We've had big increases in government spending in the past during recessions to help us get out of those. And because those tend to come with weaker inflation, as you noticed before, the right always says anytime we have a stimulus bill, basically, other than a tax cut, they say, oh, inflation is just around the corner. Just you wait. We are still waiting.
Well, what about those tax cuts? What about massive tax cuts for the wealthy? What kind of impact do those have on inflation?
Yeah, well, inflation can arise from a number of reasons, right? And just to sort of unpack it for everybody who might have had a few years go by since their Econ 101 class, like inflation fundamentally is the decrease in the buying power of currency. Usually the way we see it is as an increase in prices across the economy, not just for a specific product like college tuition or healthcare, but prices across the board, or what economists sometimes call the price level. Well, that can happen for a couple of reasons. One is for what economists call good inflation reasons. Basically, capitalism, one of its famous features is strong economic growth over time. Well, when that's happening, it's possible for the economy to be growing, we're producing more goods, we have more employment. When people have more income, they can borrow more against that. And that rising amount of money demand can outpace the growth of production. And so you get prices pushed up from that sort of healthy reason of having more economic growth. Now, because economic growth can flow from government policy, like from the New Deal policies to get us out of the Depression, or stimulus packages to get out of today's recessions, including last year's COVID recession, that stuff can contribute to demand, just like tax cuts. The key question is it adding to too much to demand to where the economy is going to push up prices and get to an overheating territory? But it depends on what else is happening in the economy. And as I say in the current affairs article, there have been changes to worker incomes and organization that make it a little less likely for this inflation to take off into the crazy levels of the 1970s.
So what's having more of an impact on prices then, on inflation? Government spending or problems with the supply chain, which has been disrupted by the pandemic?
That's a great question. Like government spending, again, the state plays a major role in everything that happens in our economy these days. But right now, that's exactly right. These supply chains we're looking at are sort of why the inflation that kind of looked like it might be a passing thing in spring and early summer now looks like it'll be sticking around, more mild than it was in the summer when we had some eye-popping numbers for a minute there. But significant enough. I mean, if you're keeping up, with what's happening logistically in the world economy now, and I mean, just many Americans as consumers, which is our main American role, of course, people are realizing, oh, I can't get that product as quickly as I used to, or it's going to take more time to get this furniture or get this thing fixed. And that's resulting significantly from the fact that basically what we're seeing now with logistics is what happens when a big disaster like COVID hits a just-in-time management system, which is very popular among the corporate world when you've got big capitalist incentives like meeting your Wall Street share performance expectation for this quarter. You can wring a little bit more money out of your company if instead of paying a warehouse to store inventory, you just have a tiny amount, you have just enough on hand at any moment, and supplies show up exactly when you need them, that so-called just-in-time system. When a giant plague comes that keeps people from working from 6 months to a year, it's ruinously disruptive to that system, which really does rely on nothing wrong ever happening. So when we look at why inflation is happening these days, the government support programs to keep people in their apartments of last year. I mean, obviously, I think most of your listeners would agree that had a place, but also supported demand through all this. So you could say that plays a role in inflation. But clearly these supply chain snarls, which I talk a little bit about in the article just to give people a taste, they are crazily extensive. What's happening out here on the West Coast where I live right now at our ports is completely nuts. We have dozens of huge cargo ships anchored in the open ocean waiting to come in to sit for many days to be unloaded. It's such a crazy traffic snarl everywhere because our whole global supply system was based on things showing up at exactly the perfectly right time. So if anything goes wrong, we're going to deal with the fallout for a while, and that's where we're at.
And the oil spill in Southern California, there's some commenters, analysts who are saying that it was caused by an anchor being dropped from one of the tankers out there, one of the freight tankers out there, and that would never happen. They would never be dropping an anchor off the port of Los Angeles otherwise because they're always moving. But now that they're having to wait out there for a long period of time, all of a sudden we're finding these other vulnerabilities. So do you think that there is going to be any abandonment of just-in-time logistics? Because before the pandemic, I saw these articles in the New York Times raving about how much it's just complete genius just-in-time logistics. But now when there's articles about these supply chain problems, very rarely do you hear or see those words in the article about this, the shortcomings and vulnerabilities of just-in-time logistics. So do you think that there's going to be any abandoning of those kind of logistical strategies?
That's an interesting question. When you look at big capitalist institutions like this, I mean, they're very short-term obsessed. I referred to meeting they're under pressure from Wall Street to meet their performance targets. On the other hand, I mean, companies do have a kind of a limited but a real sense of self-preservation. My guess is for several years after all this, we'll see firms being willing to pay a little to keep some inventory on hand, especially stuff that's a little more vulnerable to disruption or anyway was during this crisis of the last 2 years. That would be pretty plausible. We have to realize institutional memory in a country like ours is pretty limited, all through the New Deal period, from the 30s up through the beginning of the 80s, basically. For some 40, 50 years, people had the memory of the Depression in their minds. And so they were willing to support things like big taxes on the rich and government regulation of the economy and the SEC and other entities keeping banks small. Until the 1990s, they were confined to their home states to keep banks from branching and getting big. And people supported that because they had this living memory of the Depression, But by the time you get to the 80s, in the Reagan Revolution, it's been enough time for people to sort of forget that. Reagan's sunny right-wing approach was able to move people as that memory faded. My guess would be, it's just based on sort of seeing how we in the West remember things, I would guess that for the next decade or two, yeah, firms will step away from their just-in-time inventory model, start holding a little bit more stock, more essential, mission critical parts. I would bet you, unless we have another plague, in 15, 20 years, companies will be looking at it again and going, oh, I can get another quarter point out of my performance for this year and get the stock price up and get a bonus. So I expect that it will lead to that, but I bet it's relatively short-lived in the span of history,
So what do we miss in our understanding of the way in which inflation is discussed in the more mainstream corporate and public media when we do not recognize that inflation, as you were stressing, is across the full economy and not only certain sectors or products? Why is that important to stress within the political debate when it comes to inflation?
Yeah, well, I think there is a tendency for people to, just naturally, for us as consumers, when something goes up in price steep enough or quickly enough for you to notice it, people, when they've heard a headline about inflation, will go, oh, okay, this is inflation, which it may or may not be. Again, with inflation, it's when prices generally are going up across the board, but stuff like healthcare, higher ed, those industries are seeing big increases in prices, but that's because of changes in how those industries work and the huge amount of market power that those entities have. So first, there's just that issue of confusion. But of course, generally, inflation is always something that the right wing has used to beat at the left. So a second thing we should realize is it's sort of a politicized economic indicator. Inflation is very important, and it can get out of control and ruin people's savings. There are classic cases like Germany in the 30s when the government basically had to print money to pay off its reparation debts from World War I. And this led to insane levels of inflation, which played a significant role in the Nazis coming to power. Inflation freaks out people, especially like middle-class people who try to save money. So there's a lot of political baggage in this. And the right always likes to use this because they can say, the left, liberals with their big tax and spend craziness, they're spending all this money, it's adding too much demand to the economy, it's going to overheat the economy and cause inflation. But with most right-wing arguments, they have a particle of truth. That's a scenario that can happen. Like in the 70s in the US, that was a big part of our inflation. It was too much demand across the board, But on the other hand, governments tend to want to stimulate the economy when there's recession, when demand is falling, and when prices usually are going down, and what we call deflation, which is kind of worse than inflation. So we should realize that there's this history there. And also, inflation isn't necessarily a terrible thing. It tends to accompany economic growth, like we said, which is something that certainly people who support capitalism want more of, economic growth. And a lot of people would like to have increases in their standard of living and see economic growth as a way of getting that. Inflation almost always accompanies just even healthy economic growth of a conventional type, And as I mentioned in the article as well, inflation doesn't have evenly distributed effects. So if you owe money, if you're a debtor, if you owe money to some credit card company or a bank, inflation can potentially benefit you. Because remember, when inflation's happening, prices are rising across the board. Ideally, that also includes the price of labor, your wages or annual salary that you earn. And if that is the case, if the inflation includes your earnings, which it may or may not, we should come back to that because it's kind of interesting. But if your wages are going up, that's beneficial of inflation for you because it means you can pay off that dollar amount of debt you owe for your credit card or for your house mortgage. You can pay off that set amount of money with cheaper dollars, like with money that you now get more of for your job because of inflation. And you could potentially pay off the balance earlier or just feel less pain from making the regular payments, So also inflation to a certain extent benefits debtors, which is another thing that conservatives don't like. They support creditors and the money of the society who have the lending power. So I think just the main thing I would suggest for your listeners is inflation particularly has a lot of fraught political dimensions to it that people kind of don't refer to when they say, oh, the inflation rate went down 1 point today. Okay.
But the way that inflation is reported in the news media is that the people who are affected the most are the most vulnerable, yet here you are saying that inflation is good for people in debt. So because the way that the news media reports it, it's the less well-off that are the most likely to be hurt by inflation, and especially when it comes to, rising grocery prices. That's always the indicator that they talk about. And you write about the Consumer Price Index. So is the Consumer Price Index redundant when it comes to inflation? Is it basically the same thing? And what is a better metric for us to understand how vulnerable the most vulnerable are right now when it comes to increased prices?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Chuck. Yeah. So both of those things are true. Like inflation can make it easier to pay off your debt, which is much more of an issue for poor and middle class people than for the wealthy, of course, who are creditors, not borrowers. But also it is true at the same time that people who are very poor are the ones who are most hurt by rising prices, because as we know in the United States, gigantic numbers of people in this country live paycheck to paycheck, basically. And according to themselves, are several $100s away from being bankrupt at any moment, or one bad health episode away from being insolvent, So it can be true simultaneously that, rising prices can help you if you're poor because it makes it easier to pay off your credit card debt. If it also makes it harder to pay the grocery bill, it can be a wash, It depends on individuals exactly how exposed they are to all this stuff. What you referred to about the CPI is a great point. So the CPI, of course, is the Consumer Price Index, which is the most commonly referred to measurement of inflation. It's run by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's one of those economic indicators that goes on the front pages, along with the unemployment rate and the economic growth rate. Pretty much those three dominate most headline economic reporting anyway. But what people are always interested in is that the CPI, along with some other measures of inflation, it leaves out food and energy prices. And people often hear that and they go, what the hell good is this? Why is this useful? The reason that's done, at least, is that food and energy prices, those are commodity prices, and those tend to be a little more volatile than other goods in terms of their prices. Like their prices tend to shoot up and crash back down quite a bit week by week compared to other goods like cars or rent or gasoline, And as a result, your CPI can give you these crazy values depending on exactly when you collect the data, unless you omit the volatile food and energy sectors from the CPI. So it's true, though, because that does mean that we have a headline inflation measure that doesn't include arguably the two most important commodities there are, food and chemical and mechanical energy. So to answer your question, there are other measurements of inflation. The Federal Reserve uses an alternate measure itself, so there's plenty of other measures that do that, but there is at least a reason for the CPI to at least be part of our inflation landscape, because you do want something that smooths out that crazy food volatility data. But it does give us a limited picture of the price landscape. There's no doubt about it.
But inflation, you would think, would lead to a drop in retail sales because everything's going up in prices. Yet, as the New York Times reported this week, retail sales went up 0.7% in September. So is that just a negligible amount, or is there some sort of disconnect between inflation and retail sales?
Yeah, again, they're related, but all of these things depend on what's going on in the broader economy. When you want to understand these kinds of pieces of economic data and put them into context, usually the first thing you'll turn to, if you're into like macroeconomics, is to take a look at what's happening for the broader economy. Like we start with GDP, gross domestic production, the amount of production of goods and services in the economy. And then what's happening with inflation and specific numbers, like retail sales. You can put those in context with that. So last year, of course, in March, the virus comes to the US and becomes serious, and we get the big waves of government lockdowns. Last spring and summer, we get one of the steepest, deepest recessions in US history, the worst one since the 1930s now. Eclipsing the 2008-2009 recession, which was bad enough. This one's worse. It was also very short-lived. That recession went on, as we now have measurements of it from last year, for less than 6 months. And we go back to a slow, kind of halting economic growth since then. And inflation has gone up significantly since that point. So that's how we sort of put these numbers in context. Inflation's occurring as demand recovers in the economy, but supply is struggling to because of all of our supply logistical snares that we've been talking about today. So I think that's kind of the clearer context for inflation, at least based on that macroeconomic picture that we're looking at. The economy has been growing all this year, but of course, it always, as a leftist economist, it always feels kind of weird to refer to how the economy is doing, or the economy grew last year, because we're just talking about GDP, the amount of production that happens. And that is usually what people mean when they talk about how the economy is doing. But it's kind of goofy because it's disconnected from job growth. I mean, we had economic growth for almost the entirety of the Obama administration, and there was so much economic discontent, people were willing to vote for Donald Trump. Just because we're producing more goods doesn't mean people are getting jobs or healthcare or being content, So that's kind of the larger picture I would put this in. Retail sales are definitely coming back because Americans were forced to stay in for a year and a half, and they've got spending money and even some stimulus money for a lot of people. But it's difficult for them to put that money into effect when you can't go into the bar because there's seating limitations still, because you're in a state that has capacity limitations because of the Delta variant, or when you can't buy something because it's held up in a port in a shipping container in Long Beach. Like that's the, I think, sort of background for these like specific detailed little numbers. 0.7% growth for a single month is actually not that negligible, but without this broader context, it is kind of hard to make sense of this stuff.
And you're right that different assets have different levels of vulnerability to inflation. Owners of assets priced in currency like houses or stocks often feel they benefit from inflation, especially if they focus on the value of their specific asset rather than an overall price. But assets denominated in currency like cash or debt instruments like bonds are actively hurt by inflation, which directly cuts their exchange value. So does Wall Street hate inflation? Does it hurt stocks? Does it hurt home prices? Because if Wall Street hates inflation, I mean, shouldn't everybody? Because if it hurts Wall Street, it hurts everybody.
Wall Street definitely hates inflation. That's a very, very enduring pattern. I mean, there you're looking at, Wall Street, the setting where we trade pieces of companies, called stock, and pieces of debt from companies or governments that we call bonds. Okay, so those are straight up, money assets. When inflation happens, it cuts into the value of cash holdings or bonds, which represent cash payments, right? And so it tends to increase the prices of everything. If it's real inflation, it should be raising prices across the board, so including assets like housing. But something about housing is always sort of a unique market. Like middle-class people, housing, along with your car, housing is the main wealth class of asset of middle-class people. Blue collar, white collar people, like their home, whether it's fancy or humble, paying off the mortgage on that and the equity that may come from that tends to be like the big wealth focus of a lot of Americans, other than just their straight bank balances, of course. And when those things increase, and I live on the West Coast where home prices are on a psychotic rocket trip for last many years, basically since a few years after the housing crash, basically. People focus so much and foreground the value of that asset that people sort of feel very excited when they see that their home price, their home appraisal has risen, or their tax appraisal is usually how we see it. When that goes up, people feel like, oh, I have more money, and that can lead them to spend more. There's what we call a wealth effect associated with that. When people feel richer, they're looser with spending. But if that price is going up because of inflation, it's kind of foolish because prices are going up for everything else you buy. Like, yeah, your house is worth more, when your imputed rent is more, but so are your grocery and utility bills going to be. So to an extent, like there is a lot of weird psychology associated with issues like inflation. And it's not always quite so straightforward. Like we talk about expectations in that article too, as another potential cause of inflation. If you have inflation that's significant for a while, and in the US, we haven't had high inflation since the 1970s for reasons that I go into there. But when that occurs, people can get very freaked out about inflation and have long layering effects on what their consumer behavior is and what they want to do. And we talk about consumer inflation expectations. If people think that high inflation is going to continue, it starts to change their behavior. They try to buy things earlier and hoard them to lock in lower prices. It can really mess up your economy. Luckily for us, inflation expectations are coming back down. People expect inflation to be higher than it has been. Inflation's averaged 1 or 2% only, basically from the 80s until today, give or take. Right? People are expecting it to be a little higher than that, which it is, for the next year or two, and then kind of go back to its old sort of average. I think that's pretty plausible. So these are signs that people's expectations about inflation, as important as they are kind of staying in line with what we've seen recently.
We are speaking with current affairs economist in residence, Rob Larson, who wrote the article, How Serious is the Inflation Situation? You can find our past interviews with Rob at our website, thisishell.com, when you search on his last name, Larson, and you can follow Rob on Twitter at Ironic Professor. So on how the way in which inflation has been reined in since the late 70s, you write, because inflation hurts those with great wealth and can potentially help debtors, conservatives have opposed any hint of inflation for many years. Luckily for them, the high rates of inflation caused by the energy crisis and rising wages of the 1970s were decisively broken by the Reagan Revolution. How did Reagan stop inflation, and has the same process been repeated ever since?
Yeah, it's interesting. So again, if some of your older listeners will remember, like back in the 1970s was the last time we had that high inflation rate, and for a number of reasons. Okay, one of them, of course, is what we call cost pull inflation. This is our final potential inflation cause, in this case caused by the energy crisis. So if you have a fundamental input like energy in the form of oil or gas or all the derivative products, and they suddenly become less available, like more scarcity or just more expensive, companies, to the extent they can, will pass on those higher energy and production costs on to consumers. And so in the 70s, partially because of the big energy crises, which are mostly because of American policy in the Middle East toward Israel and Iran, you get these big energy embargoes on the Western countries, and you get very high inflation. But that also tends to hurt economic activity. So whereas typically you see more inflation when the economy is growing and less when it shrinks during its recession periods, during the 70s, you had the worst of both worlds. You had high inflation and recession or weak economic growth. And we actually call that stagflation, when you've got a stagnant economy along with high inflation, which is a real drag. That's a difficult economic condition to be in. Government economic policy tools are difficult to use to get out of that scenario. And so even before Reagan comes in, Paul Volcker was Jimmy Carter's appointee to run the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, of course, is basically America's central bank. They have a number of jobs, like rescuing banks that are about to go under, which we call acting as a lender of last resort, which they used a lot, of course, in 2008, which we've talked about in the past. But they have other jobs these days as well. And the main one that people pay attention to is influencing interest rates. So the Federal Reserve conducts the monetary policy, as we call it, in the United States, trying to influence economic growth through moving interest rates, the cost of borrowing money, up or down. And if the economy is in recession, you lower interest rates because that's supposed to make it easier to borrow or cheaper to borrow. And it helps people borrow money and start businesses or make big purchases that help us get out of the recession. Or you can raise interest rates if we have high inflation and kind of slow the picture down. So that's what happened in the late 70s and early 80s under Paul Volcker, who's a former Chase Bank economist. And he raised the federal funds rates up into the double digits and caused an incredibly severe recession in 1980 and 1981. At that time, that one was the worst recession since the 30s. We've been topping that record lately, sadly. But that was a pretty brutal episode. If you go back and watch media from the early 80s, it's people complaining about the Fed. And then Reagan himself comes in with a ton of support for Volcker's inflation stopping campaign, because inflicting that heavy recession on the U.S. did succeed at stopping inflation. And then Reagan came in with a big expansionary policy of tax cuts and military spending. Conservatives aren't concerned about inflation when they want to cut taxes on billionaires and raise military spending. All those things contribute to demand and inflation too. But suddenly the conservatives don't care about that too much. It's kind of, again, the transparently political nature of how inflation is discussed today. What's interesting is, Reagan comes in, and along with this very severe recession, which is brutalizing the working economy caused by Paul Volcker, Reagan comes in with his whole neoconservative program. We mentioned tax cuts and deregulation, but also crushing the labor movement, which is very important to this issue of modern inflation. Because remember what we said before, the classic model of good inflation is You've got rising economic growth, rising employment, people borrow money or demand higher wages from their employer, and then they have more money to spend, and that spending pushes up prices. Okay, the positive overheating model of inflation. Well, that does presume that workers can demand higher wages. And in the past, they did that through the labor movement. By having over a quarter of our workforce in trade or labor unions of different types across the economy, people were able to credibly say, we want to raise or we're going to strike in a month. But these days, our union density is down to the single digits, pretty painfully in the United States, because of a union breaking campaign that was inaugurated by Reagan. People forget that one of his first acts in office was breaking the air traffic controllers' strike. Those incredibly stressed out, hardworking people who keep our airplanes from crashing all the time, the air traffic controllers union, they were on strike when Reagan came into office, and he used his authority as the head of the Federal Aviation Administration to to fire them all. Sorry about that. And as a result of that, it was sort of a signal to employers that it would be open season on labor unions. And since then, companies have been on a campaign of breaking labor laws, which are not being enforced, mostly in the form of illegal conduct during union elections and doing lots of stuff like threatening to move jobs and so on, or threatening people for, threatening workers for doing their union organizing activities that are protected under federal labor law, like the Wagner Act. But they're able to get away with it if these laws aren't enforced. And that starts with Reagan. And so now we have this very weak labor movement. Somewhat to my amazement, the rest of the economics profession is sort of realizing that this matters for inflation, because if workers don't have any bargaining power through their unions to demand higher wages to match inflation, then wages may lag inflation. Okay. And even though wages haven't grown much for the last 40 years, because inflation's been so weak, like worker buying power, like for a typical median middle class American consumer, their buying power is about where it was in the 70s. Because wage growth has been very weak, but also inflation's been very weak. It's a perfect condition for Wall Street. They love hearing weak wage growth and weak inflation to eat into their earnings. It's perfect. This is very satisfactory to like the most powerful sectors of American capitalism, right? But it means that today's inflation doesn't get matched by wage growth as easily. And to my amazement, I put this in the article too, even like the most ironclad defenders of capitalism are recognizing this. And I use the example of Larry Summers, who your listeners may be familiar with. Larry Summers, of course, Harvard economist, former big economic advisor for the Clinton and Obama administrations, right? He's a big advocate for deregulating banks and letting them go on a giant merger spree and borrowing more money. We all know how that worked out. But he has a paper here. It's kind of incredible, with a grad student, of course, who I'm sure did all the work, but recognizing that the loss of worker bargaining power, specifically because of the labor movement being destroyed or being ground down significantly, that's a reason for our weaker inflation numbers all through this period. It's partially because of the fact that workers don't really have the ability anymore to bargain for higher wages like they used to. Now, COVID may be changing that. We're all seeing online like the fun memes of workers in text threads with their bosses quitting in very gratifying manner. And I love to see those. And we'll see in time how this current labor not exactly a labor shortage, our current weird labor market conditions. We'll see how much worker bargaining power we get out of that to make up for the loss of some of that labor movement density. I hope a lot, but time will tell about that. But there's definitely a big relationship there.
And Larry Summers was also an economic advisor to the Biden campaign temporarily until there was a lot of pressure on him to oust Larry Summers. You write that the low inflation of the past 40 years suggests that prices are less buoyant when the growth of purchasing power is locked up in a ruling class of people who already consume a huge amount and tend to only moderately increase it, as even wretched ruling class scumbags like Larry Summers now openly acknowledge. Your words, not mine, but I totally agree with you. So aren't less buoyant prices good for everybody as we can budget and plan and predict for the future? Does that lead to a less precarious life?
Indeed, inflation is something that no one really wants to see. It's a nuisance. I mean, that's exactly right. When I go and grocery shop too, it's never like no one wants to see that a product's gotten more expensive. That's never a favorable thing. But to the extent that inflation usually comes with economic growth, which most people do like because they see capitalism's economic growth as a potential path for them to have higher incomes and a better standard of living in the future, to that extent, inflation is something that people up to a point you could argue they should accept. It's like, yeah, it's a downside, but it's a downside of something that you want. It's like if you make more money, you get a better job, and now you realize you kind of need to move. It's like, okay, well, it's moving sucks, but if it's because you got a better job that you're excited about, it can be a drag that accompanies a broadly positive thing. And arguably the same is true here. I mean, there are a lot of problems with our endless economic growth model and so on. I'm not trying to say that capitalism works perfectly, even when it doesn't have high inflation, just to say that a lot of people see that as a favorable thing, But it's true, it does make it harder to plan like your economic activity and so on, which can be a big deal, especially if you're at a big life decision moment, like if you're moving or taking a new job or starting a family or something. Budgeting becomes something that you're really psychologically focused on, making sure I don't suddenly run out of money and can't feed the baby or something like that. And when you have higher inflation, it gets tougher to do that. What really gets hard and what really freaks people out is not just high inflation, but erratic inflation, which is something that we saw a lot of in the 70s, where you get a very high inflation number one quarter and a kind of high one next quarter, and then it would be low and the next quarter high again. That unpredictable craziness, like it alarms people generally, which can be important. Like German consumers are still scarred by Germany's 30s inflation to this day, but also makes it difficult, as you said, to like plan and project what things are going to cost. If you run a business, it's going to be a real danger for you trying to operate a business at a time when prices are shooting up or down. You make a bunch of big investments and discover that, oh, I actually can't make money from these investments because some raw material I need is now too expensive, or it's caught up in a supply problem or something like that. So inflation is definitely not a good thing. And it was very lovely, all through my life, inflation's been in that low 1 or 2% neighborhood, kind of low enough to ignore, basically, small enough to come with growth, but not big enough to scare people. But it's especially like businesses, and again, Wall Street, they hate anything over that mild level of inflation, specifically for the reason you said. It makes it harder to plan. And that's a big deal for you and me as middle-class people. But when when you work for a giant company and you make $1 million investments in multi-million dollar decisions about asset allocation, inflation that goes up and down and is high is very alarming to you. And especially if you're a conservative, which is common, of course, among people with that much money, then you already have this whole idealized version of the market in your head where it's got this efficient price mechanism and markets efficiently allocate resources and the price signals in the marketplace let you know exactly how much things cost. These are big things that conservative economists are very proud of. High and erratic inflation mess up all that because they make price signals unreliable. So there's a whole catalog of things about inflation that are a drag for different levels and different people in the economy. It can be beneficial if you owe money, but again, it's something you normally, do want to keep to a limited level. Again, because it freaks people out, and it can erode purchasing power too over time. It's real.
You write price increases in the market for used cars and trucks accounted for a full 1/3 of June's inflation spike. Why? The reopening has meant renewed demand for vehicles for workers returning to in-person work. At the same time, production has been constrained due to supply chain problems, primarily around the computer chips that are now ubiquitous in so many products. The global chip shortage itself tells us a lot about how the economy works these days. The sophisticated computer chips we rely on to run everything from our phones to our car transmissions are made by a small oligopoly of firms like Broadcom and Intel, with some making hyper-specialized chips that manage Wi-Fi connections or graphics, and others producing the processor brains of machines using them. So how does being an oligopoly lead to a shortage of supply? And does that drive up inflation as well?
Yeah, for sure. So just to make sure listeners are on the same page, oligopoly is a market structure you can have. It's like monopoly. With monopoly, you have one single company that has usually 90% market share or more is kind of the territory where we start calling you a monopoly, where you're basically the only producer of a product. Oligopoly is when you have a small number of producing firms. And oligopoly is the most common market condition in modern capitalism. If you look at our cell phone carriers, you've got three companies there, AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile. If you look at investment banking, it's Chase, Citi, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo. Any industry you can point to and name the big 3 or 4 or 5 companies, then it's an oligopoly, which means media, energy, shipping, communications, online platforms, smartphone, cell signal, and operating systems. All of these are oligopolized markets. Okay. So what does monopoly or oligopoly have to do with inflation? Well, one thing that we're seeing is this inflation problem is being aggravated a lot by these supply chain disruptions. Well, the fewer the firms are in number, the more important it is when they have issues. If you have 10 companies that make a product and half of them have a supply chain problem, okay, that could be an issue, but you still have the other half of the industry that's producing. When you have just 2 or 3 companies, or even just one, like with these semiconductor chips, okay, then as soon as any company has any issue, like with supply chains or anything else, like an earthquake or something, then it's the whole world's problem. Because suddenly this company that makes half of the industry's production, or maybe all of it, is having a big disruption and can't meet their delivery times. And that's, of course, going to end up raising prices for all the products that are made from whatever good we're looking at. And so, yeah, the example I referred to in the current affairs article, it's kind of interesting one, but it's all in the Wall Street Journal. And again, I get a lot of if you want to keep up with the economy, a good conservative business news venue is a great way to do it because it's a lot more earnest and less afraid of its audience and willing to say more candid things about capitalism. And the Wall Street Journal is very good for that kind of thing. So here we have their analysis of the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TMSC, which almost no one is familiar with, almost no American has ever heard of, some East Asian technical company, who cares? They make most of the smartphone brains in the world. They make most of those smartphone processing chips, the brains on your phone that manage the operating system and all the other chips in there, like your modem and graphics chips and so on. So that company makes all those chips. If anything goes wrong at that one company, even if they just get hit by lightning somehow, it's a huge risk for everybody. So the more concentrated and monopolized or oligopolized a market is today, the more vulnerable it is to any kind of thing going wrong, certainly including a big plague that means they can't work for half a year or a year and then puts them behind on orders and creates a global supply problem ever since. So because this company has a near monopoly on those processing chips, it's had huge effects on the rest of the economy because they had a very bad drought in Taiwan through last year, which Taiwan's government openly acknowledges, in their central bank even, has openly said is related to climate change. So other governments at least are recognizing this issue more and more, which is slightly reassuring. But because of their climate change, people need to realize that when you have a drought, that's a big deal. Making computer chips is one of the thirstiest industries there is. I talk a lot in affairs about externalities and the side effects of products that we consume and the things we don't think about when we buy things. Some of the products that we buy, the amount of precious, fresh, non-salt water they consume is incredible. It takes so much water to make a smartphone chip or a little bag of our precious West Coast legal marijuana. These are very, very thirsty commodities. And the same is true of chips. It's true of gasoline and all these other products, almonds. And it's true for smartphone chips. They're so complicated. It takes a huge amount of water to clean off the components and move them on to the next step of production. So that really hurt that Taiwan company's ability to make these important chips. Okay, and then there's COVID and the huge increase in demand for products that use these chips. And that includes things like cars. So new cars have all of these increasingly fancy computerized functions. Anyone who's been in a new car, like on an Uber trip or something for the last several years will have seen this. It means last year, when you have an increase in demand for products made from these chips and a drought in the country that has the monopoly that makes them, it means they get insanely costly. And as a result, there's also just a straight supply limitation. And so new cars, like Toyota, for example, was leaving fully completed new cars sitting on parking lots in Japan, waiting for export because they hadn't had their chips installed. And as a result, there's this decrease in the availability of new cars. And as a result, we saw, like in last June and July, as you referred to, almost a third of that spike in inflation came from used car and trucks. Why? Because there's climate change causing a drought in a country where a monopoly makes all of our chips. Like, this is modern capitalism. It's hyper concentrated markets, super powerful corporations and billionaires in a messed up environment that between COVID and climate change, it's making it harder and harder for our global supply networks to operate even in normal conditions.
You also point out that looking forward, managing inflation remains mainly the job of the Federal Reserve, a partially private and partially public body, with regional presidents elected by private banks and national leadership nominated by the president, with a great deal of independence. Technically, the Fed is expected to both limit inflation to an average of 2% and maintain, quote-unquote, full employment, usually meaning unemployment in the area of 3 to 4%. But as shown by the historic role it played in the rise of neoliberalism and austerity in the early 1980s, its banker leadership has always been more inflation hawkish than eager to see tight job markets, and could put more negotiating power in the hands of workers. So often in public-private partnerships like these, Rob, we see the private overwhelming the public. Does the Fed represent more the demands of private bankers or the public?
That's a pretty easy question. If nothing else, I'd like to point out that most of the Fed's policymaking and ranking staff usually come from the private financial services industry. They come from banks and insurers and Wall Street and investment banking and finance, sometimes from academia, academic departments that pay attention to that. But just on the face of it, I mean, the Federal Reserve is mostly run by bankers. That includes the Federal Reserve's main policymaking body in D.C. But also remember that board that makes the decisions is partially made up of the heads of the Federal Reserve's regional banks. So there's a West Coast Federal Reserve Bank headquartered in San Francisco, and one in Chicago, and one in Kansas City, and so on. And those figures are elected by their banks in their region. Like, they're actually chosen by private entities in that region of the U.S. and then sent to D.C. to be on the policymaking bodies and give their analysis and so on. So on the face of it, I mean, it's easy to see. It's a banker-run entity, from the regional bank voting process all the way up to who heads the Federal Reserve at the highest level, which very frequently is someone out of finance. We mentioned Paul Volcker, who came from Chase Bank. The current head of the Federal Reserve is Jerome Powell, who, as I recall, is from the Carlyle Group, which is the private equity group that for a while had George Bush Sr. as a prominent member. So these guys definitely come from banking. It's not surprising that they reflect a banking perspective, and as a result, they're pretty inflation hawkish, more than they are employment hawkish. If it ever comes down to a choice, as I make this point here, if the choice comes down to keeping inflation in its place or aiding job market recovery, the Fed has a long history of choosing limiting inflation, because that's Wall Street's main priority. Now, I will say, to defend the Fed here, for a lot of the last 15 years since the finance crisis, the Federal Reserve has often been the only body that's trying to support the economy and its recovery from our last two recessions, lowering interest rates to zero or close to zero, doing its big quantitative easing bond buying program, which conservatives across the board told us would lead to crazy inflation. And that never did happen, because workers don't have the bargaining power to push up their wages. Maybe they do just now, but they haven't previously. So it's not just that the Federal Reserve is picked by and nominated, the leadership is nominated by and dominated by bankers. It's also the fact that just its policy record shows this. So they are willing at times to be the only entity supporting economic recovery. It should be the Congress passing stimulus if we want to increase economic recovery. But these days, with the crazy entity that the Republican Party has devolved into, and its willingness to pay chicken, like just this month, over the nation's debt defaulting, which is a insane prospect for a party to even briefly flirt with like this. It goes to show they're willing to sabotage recovery to try to get a political gain out of it. And so that's why we often don't see any stimulus when the economy needs it, or it's only in the form of tax cuts for Donald Trump's income brackets. And so I will give the Fed credit for being sometimes the only entity trying to get unemployment down. At least they care. But their main priority will always be inflation. And if it continues to be too high, they will raise interest rates. I expect them to do that. Most observers do. And so we may see soon, again, exactly where the Fed's loyalties lie.
And you also write that, make no mistake, if the choice comes to keeping inflation in its box or aiding recovery in the job market, the Fed has, like you were saying, a long history of choosing the former most dramatically in Reagan's Fed chief's Paul Volcker's recession of the early 1980s. So must the Biden administration or any administration, must the Fed choose between addressing inflation or jobs? Is this a zero-sum game?
Well, ideally, we would have fiscal policy to help with the jobs. Again, when you have Congress pass any kind of legislation that's good for employment, such as rebuilding our falling down infrastructure, which really needs the work, like you could have support from the job market from fiscal policy. Unfortunately, the modern Democrats include a lot of big conservatives, especially in the Senate, which we've all been forced to pay attention to for the last few weeks. So it's unclear how much that fiscal policy is going to be. Just like with Obama, the administration isn't really committed to it, and they're letting conservatives in both parties water it down to where people in the majority don't really feel an impact from it. And I expect that the Democrats will get wiped out next year, just like they did in 2010 under Obama, when his stimulus package was very wimpy, partially because he listened to Larry Summers. So we'll see. The Biden administration has a lot more freedom, but because it's a modern Democrat administration, it doesn't take its agenda to the public and get big popular support behind the policy, with people in the streets every day demanding it and calling their senators constantly pushing for it. Like, that's how you do it. So many people watching politics now just, well, it's the Federal Reserve and the Congress and the White House, like in the Supreme Court, like it's just the powerful people in it. Like the New Deal happened because people were in the street. Like Roosevelt wouldn't have gotten the support for any of those New Deal programs that he did if it wasn't for the fact that there was a giant labor movement then led by the CIO that was leading sit-down strikes, big waves of work stoppages, scaring the hell out of the business community and the ruling class that owns all the stock and the companies of that business community. When you have people in the streets, like Bernie Sanders understands this, he tries to get big support for his pet projects, for his progressive policy, and it gets some success from that. But Biden, like Obama, it's okay, here's my nice progressive policy bill, just let the Senate debate it, and I won't push for it even in the Congress, let alone on TV and on a speaking tour or something. And so he's willing to let it get sliced down to a much smaller package by the conservatives in the Senate, or possibly also the House. And it'll be to their detriment, but they have the option of going big on stimulus and unemployment, and lowering unemployment. We still have 5.7 million fewer jobs than we did before the pandemic. So there's definitely work to be done. The administration could take steps forward on this, but again, before Biden became vice president under Obama, he was the most conservative Democrat in the Senate. And it's just not realistic to expect him to really commit and fight for a progressive policy package. He was willing to propose it. There's some fairly impressive and extensive provisions in the social policy and infrastructure bills that are getting sliced down to pieces right now. But if you're not willing to go in and really, really fight for it, it's going to get cut down, and it's going to be left to the Federal Reserve to try to stimulate the economy. And if inflation goes up, they probably will stop trying even to do that. So time will tell, but because of the terrible incentives and institutions that we're dealing with here, it's not a time to be unbelievably optimistic about the projection for the economy.
You write that, ironically, the threat of inflation is highly inflated by the right, who have so somberly predicted spikes of inflation at every policy turn they dislike. But this isn't just about the right anymore, correct? Because the New York Times front page has been all about the Biden administration and its fears about inflation, how it's cooling the economy and leading to not as many workers being hired in September as expected. So are exaggerated concerns over inflation now conventional wisdom across party lines and aisles today? Under neoliberalism, how much more likely is it that that hatred for inflation is bipartisan?
Well, it absolutely is. I mean, that last bit absolutely is the case. As the Democratic Party moved to the right under Carter and then Clinton and then Obama, and now has a lot of conservative policies in its platform, and often its senators are indistinguishable from Republican ones. Yeah, opposition to inflation has become very much a bipartisan policy. I mean, Clinton and Obama talked about it frequently. So that part's not even controversial. like as far as how this will shake out going forward, I think a more reasonable way to look at it is like, yeah, I'm suggesting that the threat of inflation is inflated by the conservatives. It is happening now, but they've been saying it's going to happen every time there's been any Democrat in power anywhere for the last 40 years. So I think sort of the way to sort of perceive this is like, well, like the cliche, like even a stopped clock can be right twice a day. Sometimes we do have higher inflation. And if you're a conservative who cries inflation at every progressive policy enactment, eventually there actually will be some inflation when you said there would be. But it is a real thing right now. There's a reason why the New York Times and people across the political spectrum are concerned about inflation. I mean, partially bear in mind, it's because it's kind of a novelty. We haven't had high inflation for over 40 years. 40 years. And so a lot of people, including most of my students, like that means they haven't had high inflation like in their lifetimes. So I think a lot of people are partially freaking out about inflation because, oh, I've read about this inflation. It sounded bad. If it has a lot of novelty, that also does increase how much attention people will pay. But like I say at the end of this article, too, let me say it now also, like we social scientists, we do not have a fantastic record of projecting the future. We tend to be really bad at it, actually, and misanticipate things and have our economic projections come out wrong surprisingly frequently. So I don't make a huge commitment about what's going to happen with inflation. There's so many big moving parts here that have different kinds of related issues limiting how they work. I feel like exactly what will happen with inflation is unclear. We could have a lot of effect on it with our institutions like the Fed or the White House, but they'd have to, again, have the political will to care more about unemployment to act in that direction.
One last question for you, Rob. We have been speaking with current affairs economist in residence, Rob Larson, who wrote the article, How Serious is the Inflation Situation? You can follow Rob on Twitter at @ironicprofessor. One last question for you. And as you may or may not remember, our final question is always the question from hell, the question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer, our audience is going to hate your response. So what would you say to someone who has concerns over inflation, who is not well off, complaining about higher prices? What would you say to them in convincing them that your concerns over inflation are exaggerated?
Yeah, well, I would just make this point. I would say inflation is very real. The rise in prices in the economy is very real, and for a lot of Americans live on a pretty thin margin of survival, especially for a country with this much money. So the first thing I would say is like this: we have pretty modest inflation right now, and it's enough to be brutal. So I understand that this is like not something you want to see and something that needs to go away for your economic survival. But I would make the point that higher inflation isn't so bad if your pay is also going up. If your pay rises by 4% and inflation goes up by 3%, hey, we came out ahead here. So what you care about is your inflation adjusted pay, your real income, as we call it in economics. And there it's a question of like, why aren't our wages going up fast enough? So the broader inflation picture comes from global supply chains and global policy making that we individually can have very little effect on. Right. However, your personal pay is something you can have an effect on. So if you want to get ahead of inflation, the best thing you can do is to have a unionized workplace. Because then you can pull wage increases to compensate, or even more than compensate, out of your dang employer, who's raising prices that they charge people, but trying not to raise your wage or salary. So I think what I tend to say to people is, remember that your pay is also a price. It's the price of your labor when you get your check for your wage, your hourly wage, or your monthly salary, So I would suggest that people focus less on rising prices, which are real, you can't ignore them, but focus more on getting your wages, your income to go up to match that stuff. And that can happen through trying to have workplace organization or through having more progressive economic policy out of a future administration.
Rob, it's great having you back on this show. I hope this interview doesn't do like the last one did, which was portend a pandemic. We have been speaking with current affairs economist in residence, Rob Larson, who wrote the article, How Serious is the Inflation Situation for Current Affairs? And you can follow Rob on Twitter at ironicprofessor and find all of our past interviews with Rob at our website, thisishell.com, when you search on Larson. Thank you so much for being back on the show today. This has been a fascinating conversation. We're going to bug you again in the future. Great to hear your voice again. Take care, sir.
Thanks, Chuck. My pleasure, man.
Take care.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.